and good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. Really, the big news of the week is that I got a haircut. I look nice and tidy for this presentation. And of course, I got it cut by a key worker and a skilled worker, and coiffeur des hommes, a male hairdresser. And we had a good chat. We're just coming out of one of the strictest lockdowns in Europe, and things are getting marginally easier for us. When I volunteered to speak about key workers, it was perhaps a month ago, and Dave agreed to put me in the programme. And there was considerable discussion about how awful key workers were being treated and exploited, and a word that kept cropping up was that key workers are undervalued. Around about the same time as well, there was some discussion about skill, to do with the question of migrant workers, and the basis for migration being on some sort of measure of skill. And some people, and I saw a few Facebook posts arguing that there's no such thing as an unskilled worker. I'm absolutely clear that there are such things as unskilled jobs, and they matter a lot. So what I'm going to try and work through this evening is starts with some definitions, problems of definition, just to be sure what it is that we're talking about. We'll consider the value of workers and how you arrive at a worker being valued. What would it constitute? Which leads us into inevitably a discussion of levels of pay. So I'll say something about the ways in which levels of pay are determined, and that means saying something about labour markets. So that's going to be really the focus of this evening, is the nature of labour markets and who controls them. I'm going to conclude really that workers are inevitably treated badly. That's normal. It's both the old normal and the new normal. Whatever comes out of this crisis, workers will continue to be treated badly. And we constantly have to be fighting for workers' rights, for strong trade unions, and for stronger laws to protect workers. Those battles can't be solved at a stroke. We have to keep struggling for them. So, what is a key worker? And things that emerge from the question is, well, first, what's a worker? And we're going to be talking in the main about employees, so workers who are employed by an employer to do a job for them, in return for which they get paid a wage. What's a key worker? And that is an interesting question, as to what constitutes a key job. And there's a suggestion that it can change over time, with key workers of today under the crisis perhaps not being the same as the key workers of previously. I'm very unsure about that myself, I think. But I do wonder whether the notion of a key worker is at all valuable. What we clearly have is a set of workers who have had to go to work with very little choice about it, when a lot of others of us didn't have to go to work, and were able to shelter ourselves from the virus, consequences of catching it. There's then the question of value and how you measure that. So we'll get stuck straight into that and look at the question as to what a worker is worth. And there are the main way that we look certainly at ourselves and consider that question, am I being paid enough? Am I valued enough? Then what I tend to do is compare my situation with the situation of others. So you compare your own job with the jobs that other people do. And you think, well, bloody hell, I ought to be paid more than that person doing that job, but perhaps not as much as that other person doing that other job. So it's a relative question. We measure our worth by comparing ourselves with other people. So we're looking at the value of a job relative to other jobs, and we make comparisons. And if we believe the comparison shows that one job is treated unfairly, then that matters. This question of fairness is particularly important to workers when they're looking at the way they're treated themselves and comparing it with the way other workers are treated, or comparing it with the way that workers ought to be treated. And the notion of fairness is a particularly important component of that. Of course, as far as the employers are concerned, fairness cuts no ice at all. The way that you tell whether a job's fair or not, is whether you can find somebody prepared to do it. And if they're prepared to do it, then what's unfair about that? It's voluntary. Nobody's forcing you to do it. So when you're discussing your wages with an employer, the argument that it's not fair doesn't cut much ice. What it does do is it provides an important rallying call for workers to collectively assess their situation. And if generally you can rally around the notion that it's not fair, but going to the employer and saying it's not fair doesn't get you anywhere. It also raises the issue of equality, because nobody believes in equal pay, or hardly anybody. Everybody believes that there should be differences between jobs, that some jobs should be paid less than others. Some jobs should be paid more than others. So there's no call for equal pay. There is a call for equal treatment, but if you didn't have unequal pay, then you wouldn't have a labour market. And so that inequality is an essential part of the pay framework. It's ever present. Some people get paid more than others. And generally speaking, we agree that that's okay. Most people would agree that a nurse, a skilled worker, should be paid more than a cleaner, an unskilled worker. And perhaps a doctor, a skilled worker, ought to be paid more than a nurse. So we accept inequality being a central component of the labour market. I just want to briefly mention the other approach to the value of things, and the value of a job, which is to consider it in absolute terms. How do you measure, not just by comparison, how do you establish what the value of a job or the value of work is? And the only basis for having some sort of absolute measure is to consider it as representing a quantity of work. So the value of a worker is the quantity of work that they do. And the wage that they receive in return for contributing that work always has a value that is lower than the value of the work that they do. That is where profit comes from. So if we take an employer, the total value of the wages paid by that employer must have a lower value than the total amount of work done by the workers. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a profit. It's through converting the value added by the worker into cash by selling the worker's product that the employer realizes a profit. And the value added always has a greater value than the value of the wage that's received in compensation. So if we look at the question of value in absolute terms, all workers are undervalued. They have to be, otherwise the employer wouldn't make a profit. We're all underpaid by the amount that the employer keeps as their private profit. And that's important because it means that the employer's profit can be increased by paying the workers less. So there's constant pressure to push down wages. This is the pressure is then further intensified because employers are in competition with each other. So the manufacturers of fridges, all those different enterprises, are in competition with each other to sell more fridges. And if they can reduce the price below the price of their competitors' fridges, then they'll sell more fridges and make bigger profits at the expense of the other manufacturers, because people will stop buying their fridges and buy the cheaper and better ones. So that also puts downward pressure on wages. So we're all underpaid, even under the best of circumstances. And we're all confronted with employers who have no alternative but to pay us the least they can get away with. Because if they don't, they'll lose the competition with other employers who do that. So the force of competition means that we're all of us under the pressure to accept lower pay. And of course, the biggest quantity of workers, the biggest concentration of workers is the unskilled, the low paid, the ones who do most of the work. And so the ones who are paid the least are under the most pressure to take more pay cuts. And at times when employers can get away with it, we see since 2008, wages have dropped, real wages have dropped by something like 20%, which is an enormous amount, especially for low paid workers to stand. So let's take a look at how wages are determined. How do we arrive at a level of pay? And as I've already said, the labour market is the key mechanism which we all take part in. Basically, a market is one where there are buyers and sellers. So in the labour market, there are buyers of labour and sellers of labour. And neoclassical economics would have us believe that this is a relationship between equals. So the buyer and the seller come together in the labour market, make a deal, and the one gives work and the other gives wages. And it's portrayed to us as being a fair exchange. No compulsion on anybody. No employer has to employ any particular worker. No worker has to accept employment of any particular employer. It's a free contract. Trouble is that not having a job means more to the seller than it does to the buyer. So if an employer loses a worker, it doesn't really matter. It's no great consequence. An employee loses their job, that's a big deal to them. It's not a big deal to the employer, but it's a massive deal to the employee. So the relationship isn't equal. The employer can do without the employee, but the employee can't do without the employer. It's easily illustrated if you just create a little sort of mini story of a factory with 100 employees, all paid £10 an hour. So the boss calls one of them in and says, I'm paying you £10 an hour. As from Monday, it's going to be 9. There's a guy outside the door who's saying he's prepared to work for me for £9 an hour. So you can keep your job and I'll send him away if you accept £9 an hour. And many workers under that situation will say, okay, I'll take the £9 an hour. It's know where the job's going. So the manager calls worker number 2 in and goes through the same rigmarole. There's a guy outside prepared to work £9 an hour. If you won't accept £9 an hour from Monday, he's got your job. By the time you get to the 10th worker, then the employer has saved £10 an hour and can employ another one, an extra worker. So instead of having 100, there's 101. And you work your way through, and by this process, the employer can say, I've created jobs. Employment is going down. And that's how the labour market works. That's the interaction between supply and demand, when on the demand side, the employer has no fear. On the supply side, the worker is terrified. The discipline of the market drives down wages. So this mechanism is well known. It's been around ever since the invention of the factory and the creation of unskilled labour. Because the thing about unskilled workers is they're replaceable with only, even if it takes a week to train somebody to do the job as well as the already existing workers, a week's not long. So workers are easily replaceable, easily disposable, easily sackable, just on a whim. That's why trade unions were formed. That's the basic motor for the establishment of trade unions. Because as individual employees isolated as individual actors in a labour market that operates on the basis of fear, the only strength you've got is collective. So if all of the 100 workers in our little factory say, no, we're not having that, and we're not going to allow any of those poor buggers outside to come in and do our jobs. So you set up a picket line, you tool up with sledgehammers or whatever, and you stop them coming in. And you stop work. And that's basic trade union action. Academics call it labour market regulation. It's workers acting collectively to try and regulate the price of labour. So that's the basic role of the trade union, is through collective strength to put limits on the capacity of employers to exploit the weakness in the labour market of individual employees. So to try and present some countervailing power. So regulation involves the use of sanctions for people who break the regulations. So the union goes to the employer and say, this is the rule, it's £10 an hour. If you break the rule, we'll punish you. And the main punishment is the strike. There are other punishments such as sabotage and so on, but or working slow or occupying the factory. But the key one is the strike. Now, the strike is a fairly straightforward mechanism for skilled workers to use, because skilled workers are not so easily replaceable. Whereas with unskilled workers, a determined employer can simply sack the lot, sit it out, and wait until the union goes away, and then instantly recruit another unskilled workforce. So the strike weapon works less well for workers who are weak, or in a weak position in the labour market. And this is why the trade unions created the Labour Party, was through parliamentary means to arrive at legislation that would protect workers who are weak in the labour market. So we see legislation brought in by Labour, not by anybody else, on trade union rights, employment rights, job security rights, redundancy rights, health and safety at work legislation. We see legislation on things like a national minimum wage, and on the provision through the welfare system, the social security system, of an income floor. Crucial mechanisms to make the workers less vulnerable in the labour market. And these things are all particularly important for unskilled workers. Now, as I said earlier, the problem is that even under the best of circumstances, even with strong trade unions, strong legislation, we're still in a situation where the employer is constantly trying to push our pay and conditions away from us. So we're swimming against the tide when we do this. It's inevitable under the capitalist employment relationship that we're struggling against that pressure that the employers themselves are under to cut wages, to cut conditions, to increase hours, to increase flexibility, take labour in when it suits them and to throw labour out when it doesn't. So that pressure never goes away, and it'll only go away when we've done away with capitalism. In the meantime, the struggle goes on, and we're continually having to reinvent those mechanisms, those traditional mechanisms, continually having to re-strengthen our trade unions, continually having to put pressure on through the Labour Party to re-enact legislation that the Tories governments have repealed. So it's always ebbing and flowing. The struggle ebbs and flows, and there's no end to it. No end to it at all until capitalism ends. So as long as we have capitalism, we have this ebb and flow of our pay and conditions. And we have, I like the image of swimming against the tide. We're always banging our head against the wall, to mix up loads of metaphors. Okay, I'll stop there. I hope that's been okay. And I look forward to some questions, challenging questions, hopefully.